A pleasant day, everyone. So, I am Marilyn Bianyo, and for today, um, we will talk about Sapir-whorf hypothesis. So, this is just actually a continuation of this topic because the origin and the reason why this hypothesis was created has been discussed earlier. Now, um, let's talk about the two components of this hypothesis. But before that, since we're talking about language and culture, allow me first to have a short view about language and culture. Now, language is a mean of communication, and accordingly, language separates us from other species of animals. Now, culture is a characteristic that's being shared by the community, and then culture also is learned by other people. Now, language and culture are both interrelated because language plays a very important role in elaborating, in transmitting, and also in developing culture. So, in short, culture cannot be executed without language. Now, in the context of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, so this theory was being started by Edward Sapir and being continued by Benjamin Lee Whorf. So this theory highlights the interconnection of language and culture, wherein this refers the grammatical and verbal structure of one's language that influences on how they perceive the world. Now, the two components of this hypothesis are linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity, wherein these two concepts explores the relationship between language and thought. Now, the first component is linguistic determinism, wherein it is said to be the stronger version of the hypothesis. Also, this suggests that language determines thought. Language determines thought. So, this theory was associated with linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf, posits that the semantic structure of a language influences its speakers' mental categories and also in their ways of thinking. Semantic structure of language is the underlying organizational framework that dictates how meaning is constructed and interpreted. So, meaning, the sense of linguistic expressions influences its speakers' mental categories and in their ways of thinking. Because languages differ in how they refer to basic categories and dimensions. Like, for example, in time, there are countries or like other countries that do not have a particular word or a particular structure for past tense, for present tense, and for future tense, then in that case, the speakers of that language might find it difficult to conceive of that concept. Why? Because they cannot determine if they are referring um, to if they cannot determine on what they are referring. Is it already happening, or is it um, not yet happening, or it will happen in the future? So in addition to that, Brown and Lindbergh's theory also add to this by showing with real evidence that how we see colors can influence by the language we use. So, for example, um, if a language has separate words for light blue and dark blue, so then speakers might more likely to perceive this as distinct colors. Yes, it is distinct because it has a specific terminology comparing to speakers who only use a single word for both shades. Speakers cannot differentiate the term in this case. So, for example, during the Siglakas activity, wherein we are instructed by the TED department to wear blue shirt, but they did not give us the specific terminology on what specific blue should we wear. Then the result is that some are wearing light blue and some are wearing dark blue. So that would be the possible conflict if a language don't have a specific terminology. So that's how language determines our thought. So linguistic determinism is the idea that language completely determines the way its speakers think, perceive, and understand the world. So this suggests that the structure and vocabulary of a language are not just reflective or reality but actively shape it by constraining cognitive processes. So, for example, so based on the example that I have said earlier, if a language has no word for a particular concept, then speakers of that language might find it difficult to conceive of that concept at all. So the key point of linguistic determinism is that the available linguistic tools or words and grammatical structures in a language can shape how its speakers perceive and think about a certain aspects of their world. So this demonstrates linguistic determinism by showing how the specific linguistic tools available in a language can shape and limit the ways of which its speakers can conceptualize and communicate about certain aspects of their world. Okay, for the second component of this hypothesis, which is the linguistic relativity, wherein it is said to be the weaker version of the hypothesis, suggests that language influences but does not strictly determine thought. So the hypothesis said that the structure and vocabulary of a language influences on how its speakers perceive and think about the world, only influence but does not determine it entirely. Unlike linguistic determinism, wherein language determines thought, so in linguistic relativity, language influences thought. So this theory suggests that while language affects thought and perception, it does not rigidly dictate them. Cognitive processes are more flexible and universality shared across humans. So example of this linguistic relativity is the smiling faces of every Filipinos even during a crisis, because this is serves as an example of linguistic relativity because it reflects how cultural and linguistic factors shape social behaviors and attitude. So in this case, the Filipino language and cultural norms may encourage positive expressions and a resilient attitude in the face of adversity, demonstrating how language can influence perception and behavior. So therefore, linguistic relativity um, provides a framework for understanding how language influences thought and behavior. So the perspective of this theory, guys, is uh, allows us for the possibility that other factors also, such as culture and experiences, play a significant role in shaping how people think and see the world. Now, what is the difference between linguistic relativity and linguistic determinism? Well, linguistic determinism asserts a strong deterministic influence of language on thought, suggesting that language confines or limits cognitive abilities. So, linguistic determinism is referring only to what available linguistic tools a speaker should use. While linguistic relativity, on the other hand, acknowledges the influence of language but does not see it as um, deterministic. So those are the two key components of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. However, there are criticisms that circulates around this hypothesis. So the hypothesis that language determines thought suggests that the structure and vocabulary of a language affects on how we perceive and view the world. However, critics like Noam Chomsky believe that um, that the theory of universal grammar, so the innate language, so about language, it says there is this certain grammar that gives a way to all people to easily understand language wherever they came from. So this shows that while language influences thought, it does not entirely determine it. So there is this cognitive process also rooted in our biology. So that's according to Noam Chomsky. So Worf's original studies on the relationship between language and thought, particularly his analysis of the Hopi language, have been criticized because his work lacked of systematic empirical evidence and only relied heavily on anecdotal observations, meaning his conclusions were often based on personal accounts and informal data rather than a rigorous scientific research. So his shortcomings determine the validity of his conclusions about the relationship between language and thought. So empirical research reveals the universal patterns in cognition, such as color categorization and numerical reasoning, so which suggests thought processes are not entirely shaped by language. So, empirical research in the field of cognitive science has shown that there are universal patterns in human cognition, such as color categorization. So, these patterns suggest that thought processes are not entirely shaped by language, but rather share commonalities across different cultures and languages. So example, the studies conducted by Berlin and Kai on color terminology. So they demonstrated that people from diverse linguistic background categorize colors in similar ways. So this suggests that the cognitive process of categorizing colors is a universal human ability, not solely determined by the specific language one speaks. So culture, environment, and social practices um, play a significant role in shaping thought, independent of in shaping thought, uh, independent of linguistic structures. So, for example, someone from a culture that emphasizes visual representation may have better spatial reasoning, so their ability to think and understand. So, better spatial reasoning skills compared to someone from a culture that focuses more on verbal communication. So, this example shows that thinking is a complex process shaped by various factors such as culture, environment, and social practices, and not solely by linguistic structures. So another criticism of this hypothesis is the deterministic form of hypothesis is largely discredited, but weaker form, linguistic relativity, remains influential. So the deterministic form of the hypothesis has been largely discredited. Accordingly, since the transformation of the hypothesis, discussion about has never been ended. So many linguists and philosophers criticize it because they argue that if thought is totally dependent of language and there is no thought without language, then interaction between two different cultures is not possible. So contemporary research studies by Lera Boroditsky supports the idea that language influences thought and cognition. So that's why, as mentioned earlier, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, also known as linguistic relativity. So since linguistic determinism is still on debate, so it's not being accepted. So that is why Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is also known as linguistic relativity, because linguistic relativity, this component has been accepted by many scholars, many linguists. So that's the reason why. Now let us proceed to the supporting evidence. So language associated habits we acquire play a role in how we view the world. And indeed, this is especially true for languages that attach genders to inanimate objects. So many languages like Spanish, French, and German have a grammatical gender system where nouns are categorized as either masculine or feminine. So this system can influence how speakers perceive and describe the world around them. Then the speakers of each language have developed preconceived notions of something being feminine or masculine, not due to the object's characteristics or appearances, but because of how they are categorized in their native language. So studies also have shown that speakers of languages with grammatical gender tend to associate certain characteristics with these genders. So example, feminine nouns often describes as delicate or beautiful, while masculine nouns often describe as strong or powerful. Then the gender of a noun can affect how people perceive and interact with the objects it represents. So in languages with grammatical gender, feminine and masculine, speakers may be more likely to remember words of a particular gender because it has a specific terminology of that particular gender. Then the speaker is most likely to have been a Spanish-speaking country because languages that attach genders to inanimate object is particularly relevant to languages like Spanish, so which have a pronouns grammatical system. Now, this often seen as a window into understanding cognitive processes because it emphasizes the influence of language on thought and perception without claiming to be an absolute theory. So successfully achieves openness because by acknowledging that language influences but does not rigidly determine thought, the theory allows a more nuanced understanding of human cognition. Why? Because it offers a flexible, open perspective on how language influences thought and perception. It acknowledges the role of language cognitive processes while also recognizing the influence of other factors. So in short, in short, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is also known as linguistic relativity because it does not only determine thought, but rather it considers the other factors, such as culture, experiences, and societal factors influences our thought. So